It's with great faith that I left the finger paint down there on the first row, and I'm praying that Pastor Doug doesn't get into it while we're in that service here. I think he looks like he's going to be good today, so we'll trust him. Today's gospel lesson marks a watershed moment in the ministry of Jesus. Everything up to this point in Mark has shown Christ's power and authority and the mercy with which he uses those things for the good of others. Healings, exorcisms, miracles. Every movement after this passage and the transfiguration passage that follows is the road to the cross, Christ's sacrificial death for our sake. Jesus would live out who he was born to be by facing rejection and death. But living out his purpose by dying was a strange and unwelcome concept to his followers. And the invitation for the followers to also live out their faith by dying to self feels strange and unwelcome to us too, if we really let that percolate in our minds and hearts. It feels like a serious mismatch that life would come from death. It doesn't feel like the shadow looks like the original picture, but we have to look at that with the eyes of faith. And so we're going to examine that a little bit. We're far away from this story, both in time and place, but let's try to hear it as though we're hearing it for the very first time, just as the disciples were hearing this for the very first time. There's a flow to the conversation that Jesus is inviting them into. First, who am I? Who is Jesus? And second, what does being Jesus, being the Messiah, mean? What does the Messiah do, or how does the Messiah act? And then third, what does being a disciple of Jesus, the Messiah, mean? So there's something about Jesus finding out what people say of him that leads all the way to what we say about ourselves and how we follow. So first, Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And since he seems to know and understand this, it seems likely that this is for the benefit of the disciples. Exactly why is uncertain, but maybe for them to consider how others' perceptions color their own understanding of him and limit it or steer it off course. And after Jesus polls the public opinion, then he asks them pointedly about their own thoughts. But who do you say that I am? You. Peter, like the student that has the right answer and can't wait for everybody to see that, just blurts out, you're the Messiah, the right answer. However, we quickly see that Peter knew the title, but he did not have a clue about what it meant. And likely Peter's confession and the ensuing confusion spoke for them all. Because here, for the first time in Mark's gospel, Jesus openly, plainly tells them what being the Messiah will mean. He began to teach them, the scripture says, that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And Peter would have none of this. This talk of rejection and death did not compute with what he and others envisioned the Messiah to be. It wasn't a match. That shadow doesn't match the picture of what it means to be a Messiah. In Peter's mind, a Messiah meant power and victory and glory and rule, not defeat, not death that Jesus is talking about here. So Peter is convinced that all Jesus needs is a really good talking to. You know how your mother used to say, sit down, and your mother sat you down, and you had a talking to? Peter's going to do that with Jesus, except they're standing up, supposedly here. But Peter takes him aside and has a good talking to Jesus. He tells him, get with the program here. None of this defeatist vision. He has to live up to the title of Messiah. People are counting on him, after all. Quickly and sternly, Jesus rebukes Peter. "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Peter here is a mouthpiece for Satan, and like Satan's temptations offered to Jesus in the wilderness at the start of his ministry, Peter is tempting Jesus to take a shortcut to glory without the death, without the suffering. "Get behind me," Jesus says. "You, Peter, must follow me where I must go, and not lead me by your mistaken understanding of what the purpose of God is for the Messiah. Follow, not lead." In other words, Peter's shape of Messiah did not match the reality of God's plan of salvation. Jesus continues to teach Peter and the disciples and calls those gathered around to join in, to come closer and hear what it means to really follow him. To follow, it would mean to deny themselves. It still means that today. It means to deny ourselves. Take up the cross and go where Jesus leads. It doesn't say deny yourself something like chocolate or desserts during Lent. It doesn't say that. It says deny self, the very ego in all of us that strives to always come out on top and be in control. To bear our crosses has been utilized to mean so many things. Anything from being patient with life's vicissitudes to suffering abuse without complaint. And these words of Jesus mean neither of those. Jesus is teaching a paradox here, that life is only truly life when it's lost in the vastness of God's love for us. He says those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will find it. It seems like a mismatch that life comes from death, but it isn't. It's a spiritual reality in a world that barely or never sometimes understands that reality. One day, we who choose to save ourselves would stand before the one who chose not to save himself for our sakes. Think about that. One day, those who choose to save themselves must stand before the one who chose not to save himself for our sakes. Though we're constantly told a contrary message, Jesus speaks truth to us. And that truth is this, that a person can never possess his or her life. And in the words of Lamar Williamson Jr., we learn what it means to be a disciple, someone who, by God's grace, follows Christ, not ashamed of and living his lowly and loving way, living lowly and loving lives for God. That's the key of understanding what it means to live in Christ. That's the key of understanding how our shadow matches the glorious life and ministry of Christ. What does it look like when we place Christ at the center rather than our own desires or agenda? And constantly, consistently surrender to the love of God. When we do that, every part of our lives is affected, even our speech, and maybe particularly our speech. The gospel passage for today is so significant that I couldn't ignore the opportunity to preach on that and highlight it, what it means to be a disciple. But James, once again, gives very practical application in his teaching on speech that is so fitting for a disciple. Could not be more timely in our world of 24-hour news cycles and social media gone amok. especially in this election year where speech is used to mock and misrepresent and cause division and fuel violence. There is so much of that it is tempting to just disengage and remain silent. But we mustn't, because there's a gift in God's speech, and that gift of speech to us as well to mirror. It's interesting that last week's gospel ends with the gift of speech being given to a man who had been mute his whole life, until Jesus loosens his tongue and allows him to speak. And then today, as if by some sort of a follow-up that the Revised Common Lectionary Committee thought of, James warns us of the power of an uncontrolled, too loosened tongue. It's a little member of our body, but one that sets the very course of our lives. Like a rudder on a ship or a bit in a horse's mouth, that one little thing steers the direction of life. Our speech testifies what's in our hearts and minds, and it sets a direction for our lives, whether that direction be healthy or destructive. James warns that we must, with God's help, control our speech, that our very lives are affected by how we use or misuse God's good gift of language and speech. If we confess faith in God through Jesus, then our speech should sound like Jesus' words. There should be concern for others, truthfulness. They should be graced with peace and mercy. They should stand up for the weak and care for our neighbor. Our words matter. Our words are our testimony. Our speech must match that shape of Christ, that testimony of Christ. Discordant speech is all around us. It's the air we breathe, especially these days. But we must see that is incongruent and mismatched to the way of Christ and the necessary death of ego, because we are what we speak, and what we believe comes out in that language. Words can cause and sow such hatred and division. I will tell you a couple of stories from our hometown as examples here, recent examples of words that sow hate and discord and division. And it spreads like wildfire. It's not that one word is spoken and usually it's ignored. If it's evil, if it's bad, if it's hateful or violent, it seems to spread all the more. So last weekend, Marion had a fall festival, and they ordered a big banner to put up across the sign, as a sign for it, to announce it. And the person that they ordered it from, the printer, came and put up the sign, and then everyone noticed, Marion's Town Festival does not have an apostrophe. It just says like Marions, like plural Marions. And there are 32 Marions in the United States, so yeah, there you go. That causes confusion in itself. But there is no apostrophe, and so people started fighting. We have 3 social groups in our town. They're friends of Marion and families of Marion, and Marion is a wonderful place to live or something as the other one. There are 3, and on all 3 of those, people were fighting about the apostrophe. Take the sign down, it makes us look so ignorant that we don't know grammar in Wayne County. And they were fighting back and forth, and others are like, hey, it's like this big, it's an apostrophe, let it go. Next year we'll correct it before we put it up again. And it became such a fight that people started saying things about your family and the way you talk, and you don't know proper grammar anyway. And it got to the point where the administrators of these 3 groups had to take it down, not the sign. They left the sign up. But they took down all of the discussions around these. And people that were next door neighbors and friends started fighting with one another. And now there's another thing happening in Marion. It is a nice place to live, but it just seems like this fall has kind of stirred things up. So it is against zoning regulations in Marion to have a used tire on your property. That may be because once in Marion there was actually quite a large tire fire, and that does put noxious gases into the air. Or it may be because someone there a few years ago who was involved in town government got encephalitis from a mosquito bite, and it had, they thought, been bred in tires that were left. So anyway, you're not allowed tires in Marion. But one woman thought, why not repurpose tires? And so she took tires and she made a tiered garden in her backyard. Holy moly. People are so up in arms, and at first there's it's my right to do whatever I want on my property, and then there is the, let's do this for the health and welfare of all. And people are once again, only 1 week later, in a really bad argument. Some people are actually in protest putting a tire in their yard with an American flag in it. There you go. Warren and I are not getting involved in this fight. We're just kind of rolling with it. Okay. I'm waiting to see if you get that. Okay. Okay. But there is such discord. There's so much discord in our world today that the least little thing becomes something to argue about, something to show disrespect or hatred toward. Warren and I are reading the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. It is a long book. It's like 650 pages long or whatever, but each chapter is so well done that you can just read a chapter a day and feel happy with that. It is a wonderful explanation of how divisions in the human family happen and how people are assigned different levels of respect and work and opportunities in life, all of that. It uses three main groups of people: the Indian caste system from the country, India, and Hitler's Germany, and also our racial relations in the United States. So each chapter is, different. It's on one of those. It's interesting how Hitler's agenda started with words. Propaganda against the Jews so desensitized people that the genocide that came later didn't bother them as much. They were so desensitized and so hearing stories about a particular incident and generalizing whole populations that they no longer worried about people who were different from them, in a different category than them. I only use that example here because the history is so widely known that there's not a lot of contextual explanation that's needed. But listen carefully, because that phenomena is never laid to rest. It's never put in a box and put aside. And even as you listen to campaigns and listen to what people say today, you will see that there's a generalization that is spread against groups of people, whether it be immigrants, LGBTQ people, whatever that is, that there is a generalization made that desensitizes us even when we may not be really aware that we're being desensitized. Every marginalized group in our country and in the world is first demonized by words that become widely known and accepted and turn into actions of varying degrees of hatred. There's a power in words. And I'm not talking just a political power either. I'm talking about words and our family systems. When I taught counseling courses, I was always emphasizing the fact that in families, you get into communication loops where the same people have the same approach to communication, whether there's one person who's a scapegoat and put down, or whether people ignore the difficult questions because that's their way of communicating as escapism. Whatever that is, it's repeated and repeated until patterns are established, and then it is very hard to get out of those patterns. They're hard cycles to break, but we must be aware and carefully, prayerfully ask for God's wisdom and grace. Now, when you read James, you might think the way James says that, it makes it sound like the tongue is just so evil, don't even try, just give up. But that is not what James is saying. James is saying in our own power, we would be powerless to control the tongue. And it is hard to control, and that is why we need God's grace and God's Spirit directing in our lives. We want our words to match the words of Jesus, the very life and character of Jesus. We want our whole life shape to look like that match of Jesus's, so that people see in us something good, some small reflection or glimmer of Christ, and want to know more about that. I love John Calvin, and I know in a lot of Wesleyan circles that's not often said, so there you go. I love John Calvin, and Doug knows I love him. I don't love everything that has been said by John Calvin or the way that people have repeated it and sometimes made it even more harsh than Calvin was. But I love the fact that at 25 years old, Calvin sat down to try to write a commentary of the Bible because he was so worried about the world and where people were in that and wanted them to find Christ at the very center of things. John Calvin saw self-denial as a summary of the Christian life, and he talked about it as a surrender to love. And so I want to end with these words by him, a poem by him that's found in the Institutes in the third book. We are not our own. Therefore, neither our reason nor our will should predominate in our deliberations or actions. We are not our own. Therefore, let us not propose it as our end to seek what may be expedient for us according to our own flesh. We are not our own. Therefore, let us, as far as possible, forget ourselves and all the things that are ours. On the contrary, we are God's. To him, therefore, let us live and die. We are God's. Therefore, let God's wisdom and will preside in all of our actions. We are God's. Therefore, towards him as our only legitimate end, let every part of our lives be directed, even our words. Amen.